virtual American Lit students we're reviewing for the test on Wednesday. So John Smith, make sure that you can recognize, I'm not going to ask you the names of his text, but make sure that you can recognize them. So remember, they were pretty long, and I did have those on I think, a PowerPoint or something, or just notes that I had posted or that I had up here out on the Promethean. So he was sent by QE1 to, after they saw what the Spaniards were doing and they had been so successful in finding gold and other things that had made them very rich, the country. And so he came over as an explorer, and he had to run in, remember, with Pocahontas, and so we kind of talked about her as well. So just be able to mostly why he was important as a historical figure and as a literary figure. So the text that he wrote, and then so he was important because we would not have known about the first permanent British colony that he established at Jamestown. We would not have known about it if he had not written about the account. We wouldn't have known anything about it. And so he was the leader, one of the leaders of it, but he actually became the leader. And if you'll remember that whole situation, he came over and he was accused during the months at sea of trying to create a mutiny and to overthrow the ship's captain and the men that were working for him. And so anyway, the plan had been, they locked him up on the ship and they were going to hang him when they got to land. But then when they arrived at land, the ship's captain had been given orders by QE1, and they were in a sealed envelope for him not to open until they reached land. And it was going to give him further instructions about, some certain things and how to establish the colony, this sort of thing. One of the things that it included was a list of the men on the boat that were going to be, that she wanted to be the leaders of the colony, or they started setting things up and trying to establish this colony. And so John Smith was one of those people. And so that's what saved him. Otherwise, he would have been hanged. And so he did rise to the occasion and became the main leader. Remember that it was a work for food colony. And so if you didn't work, you weren't going to eat. So also they started out 100 men on the ship, and within just a very short amount of time, once they had reached land, they were down to about 50 men. So about half of them perished, either from disease or attacks from the Native Americans. And so he was eventually he was taken by the Native Americans, and he was the father of Pocahontas, and they took him and they had imprisoned him for several weeks, and they were actually treating him, I guess, pretty good. I mean, except for the part that he was in a cage, but other than that, they were feeding him really good, like trying to fatten him up, and so he kind of thought they were probably going to kill him and eat him or something, but they didn't. And so the whole story that I'm sure, very much embellished, that he was taken in front of the tribal leader, their chief, and he was about to, this is according to John Smith, bash in his head with a big stone or something, and the Pocahontas fell on him or cradled his head, and it kept him from, because she was in love with him and all this, and that it kept him, that's what saved his life. And really they think now that was probably very much embellished, and that it was probably nothing more than some type of ceremony that was actually accepting him into as their friend, and this sort of thing. So he was known for being very temperamental. He was very difficult to get along with, but he was also known to be quite a braggart and to embellish things. So he was actually only at the Jamestown colony, I believe it was less than 2 years, and he had that unfortunate incident with a bag of powder exploding in his lap. So he had to go back to England, and his plan had been he always planned on going back to Jamestown, but he never went back to Jamestown. And he did go further up the coast to what's now like the Rhode Island area and such. And his plan had been to also, he'd written a text that really was nothing more than propaganda to try to get the Puritans that were, because remember, a lot of them were leaving. This was about the time where they were wanting to leave England because of the persecution. And so he tried to persuade them to hire him to lead them, and help them colonize, to be a leader. And they had heard, I think initially, they planned on doing that, hiring him, paying him to take them across and help them set up colonies along what's now the East Coast. But then they heard how difficult he was, and they changed their minds, and instead they hired Miles Standish, he was another adventurer, and they actually just bought John Smith's text and the maps he had of Virginia, and they bought them and gave them to Miles Standish, and so he used them, and he's the one that led them and took them and helped them settle. So anyway, he never did make it back to Jamestown, but anyway, he's an important literary figure because of the text that he wrote. And then, and he wasn't a writer, and his texts are not particularly good. For one thing, he goes back and forth in person and from the point of view that he's telling his, that he's relaying his stories. And so, he refers to himself sometimes as him and he and this sort of thing, which is very odd because he's talking about himself. So, they're odd texts in that way. They're not well written. But again, they're the only text that anybody has of what happened there at the establishing of that colony. So anyway, a little review of John Smith. Massachusetts Bay Colony is the company that paid for their voyage over. Talk a little bit about that. And so, other ones that were some deep pockets, Brits that were trying to, and it really wasn't even so much that they necessarily wanted to colonize, because they had tried that back years earlier and it didn't work, but it failed miserably. But they were hoping that they could send some explorers over that could find gold and silver and that sort of thing, and make Britain rich, much like the Spaniards had done. So, okay, a little bit about John Smith. Then we had John Winthrop, who went over on the Arbella, Arbella, although I have seen it spelled Arabella, but we're just going to go with Arbella. So he was one of the first groups of Puritans to go over. He was on the Arbella, and there were 3 other ships, so there were a total of 4 ships that went over, and they settled around Massachusetts area. And so he was, if you remember, he was not a minister. A lot of people think he was, but he was not a minister. He was, in fact, he was an extremely strict Puritan, though. But he was not a minister, but he is what was called a layman. So his text, where he talks about the city upon a hill and a model of Christian charity, by the way, is the name of that text. And he does deliver it on the Arbella, and there's a lot of discrepancy on this. They do know he wrote it, though, while they were making the trip. And the trip, again, took them several months. I think they had some problems with weather, and they got thrown off course, and there were some things like that. So it took them quite a few months before they made it to land, and they do know that he wrote the text while he was on the ship and on the sea before they made it to land. But the discrepancy is some historians say that he read it right before they actually, reached land, maybe a couple or 3 days before. And then there's some historians that say no, they had actually reached land, had docked, for lack of a better term, I guess, and it was before they actually got off the ship. So in any case, he did read it before anyone got off the ship. I do know that, before they actually set foot on land. And so a model Christian charity, and basically he was outlining to these Puritans what was expected of them, and that they were to, the eyes of the world would be upon them. So they were to be like that, a city upon a hill. So that's one of the more memorable parts of his whole speech. And it's much like a rallying cry, actually, because, think about it, they had an extremely difficult few months on the sea. A lot of people were very, very sick. I'm sure they probably lost some people. And we had families coming over, and some of them had little children and such. And so it's been a really rough few months. And so he was trying to rally them, that they all needed to come together, and they all were going to be very dependent on each other, and they were to help their neighbor. And if you were a good farmer and could grow crops, the expectation was that you were to give your crops to your neighbor who wasn't a good farmer, and that the expectation would be whatever their talent was. So maybe they were good with carpentry or something, good with their hands. So they were in turn to, make sure that you had a roof over your head, and that you had the needed furniture that you might need, and this sort of thing. So it wasn't a work for food colony like John Smith's colony was, the Jamestown colony. However, the expectation was that what you had was also your neighbors, and vice versa. And so in that way, it was very much, it was a feeling of unity, no individuality, which was completely opposite of when we get into the romantics. But they had to depend on each other. They would have never survived. And so city upon the hill, a hill, and the eyes of the world would be upon them, and that if they took their eyes off God, they would not survive as a colony. And if they failed, they would be failing God. And so a little bit about John Winthrop. And Bradstreet also was on a passenger on the Arbella. She would have been present when John Winthrop gave his speech in a model Christian charity. And she, again, another extremely devout Puritan. She was very young, would have been very young when she came over. She'd married her husband at 16. And I think this was about a year and a half later, maybe 2 years after they had married. So she would have been probably around 18. And if she didn't already have a baby, she had one pretty soon after they got there. And so she had 8 children. And I've read again different accounts, but the one that I think probably the most reliable is that all of her children did live to be adults, which was extremely unusual for that time period. And so very devout Puritan, her husband and her father were both at different times governors of Massachusetts. Now, oh, by the way, that's another thing about John Winthrop. He was, over a period of 20 years here, different periods of time, was also a governor of Massachusetts. In fact, I believe he was the first governor of Massachusetts, John Winthrop. But then, Anne Bradstreet's father and her husband at different times were also both governors of Massachusetts. Her family, including her husband, also were instrumental in Harvard Divinity School, and so in getting that, creating that university, in getting that going, so they're very much responsible for that. In fact, there is they have something set up for Anne Bradstreet at Harvard. It's like a little, kind of a plaque, and that's not where she's buried, but they do have a kind of a memorial, I guess you would say, of her. If you go to Harvard and you look for it, I don't know where it is exactly, but I do know they have it on somewhere on that campus. And so we talked a lot about her poetry, so you might want to just kind of go back through that packet. One of the things that she had to overcome was that women were at that time not to be writers at all. That was not what they were supposed to do. Remember, she was lucky in that her family very much valued education, and her father was in he had worked for, when they were still in England, he had worked for a man that was in he was a duke, I believe, and so he had children around Anne's age when she was growing up, and so because he worked for him, he was able to have Anne go to their home, and she was able to take advantage of the fine education that the Duke's children were privileged enough to have. And so she was also extremely smart, so she was very, very, very much educated, especially for a woman during that time period. And so she knew much about Greek mythology, and I think she knew Latin and studied Latin and this sort of thing. And so, but being a Puritan, a good Puritan, she actually just wrote her poetry for herself. She never, ever intended for any of it to be published, but her brother-in-law took some of her poetry without her knowing it, and on a trip back to England, he had it published. And so she was not happy with him at all. In fact, I think she was pretty angry with him, and with good reason. For one thing, those poems were private and not meant to be read by anyone but maybe her very close family members. And secondly, because their eyebrows were very much raised in the Puritan community over a woman writing. And one of those men was John Winthrop, and also William Bradford. And we didn't read any of his texts, but there were two early Puritan leaders of the Massachusetts area, and they very much frowned upon that she was writing, poetry. And so she kind of makes digs at both of them in a couple of her poems, and we did read a couple of those. So she used a lot of, she was very descriptive in her poetry, a little bit more simplified language in some of it, I would say, than certainly compared to Edward Taylor. She used conceits, not metaphysical though. That's the difference between she and Edward Taylor, so don't get confused on that. And remember, a conceit is a long-running metaphor. So we looked at some of those. One of them that we read was the author to her book, so where she's comparing her poetry and her work much like her children, so like a child, and sending it out, and it's imperfect and this sort of thing, but she loves it all the same. That's a conceit. What else do you want to say? Upon the burning of our house, they did lose everything. She was, this would have been, I think about 6 years before she passed away, I think. And they had a house fire, so that's what that was about. And that's a great poem. And she, you see in her work very much her faith. Remember, though, she did go through a period of time when she very much questioned her faith. She didn't want to leave England, and she had quite a nice life there, did not want to go to England, and she was very, very unhappy when they first got there, and understandably, because, it was wilderness. There was nothing set up for them, nothing. But she did have kind of this epiphany, I guess, that it was God's will for her to be there. So once she she accepted that. Then she made the best of her situation, and they actually ended up moving several times, I think 3 or 4 times, but they always were around that Massachusetts area. Let's see, what else do we want to say about her? Anything else to say about Ian Bradstreet? Um, Edward Taylor. So Edward Taylor, he would have been like a second generation Puritan, and he is one that went to Harvard Divinity School. He came over. Well, let me back up just a moment. Sorry. So he came over. He was a young man, probably around 20, 21, something like that. He was in England, living in England. His family, he and his family, very, very, very strict Puritans. And he was worked in a school. He was an educator, a teacher, and he left because the Church of England, which remember they were Catholic, asked him to swear an allegiance to the church, and he refused to do that. So he left. He was fired. And he decided that was a good time for him to maybe leave England and to go over to colonies. So he did do that. His family did not go with him. He was single and alone. He didn't have children or anything, no wife. And he went over by himself. And so he also went to that same area, Massachusetts area. And he was there, I don't know, probably a few months or something. And he was accepted into Harvard Divinity School, which at that time was for the training of men to go into the ministry. And that's pretty much, their student body. They were all there to be ministers. So that's why it's called Harvard Divinity School. And so he went there, and again, there's some discrepancies on whether he actually graduated or not, but I do know he was there for about 3 years. And a group of men from Westfield, Massachusetts came, made the trek, which was about 100-mile trek from Westfield to there where Harvard is, and they sought him out. I don't know how they knew about him. I've never read anything about that account, but in any case, they went to seek him out, and they talked him into going back with them. So he made the trek back, the 100-mile trek, and it was in the winter. I do know that, I've read that. And he didn't make any promises that he would necessarily stay, but they had sought him out because they needed a minister, a pastor of their church, their Puritan church there in Westfield. And so he agreed, and it turned out he never left Westfield. I'm not saying he never went anywhere else, but meaning he never moved away. He lived there the rest of his life. He was the minister. He was also the physician, the town physician, the town undertaker, and then he also wrote his poetry. And that wasn't unusual. Usually the most educated person in the community, he would have been a man, he wouldn't have been a woman. The most educated man in a community or colony often would be the doctor, even though they didn't have any medical experience, and they didn't have to have a medical license or anything like that back then. So that's why he worked also as a doctor. We talked about this, that he did practice alchemy, and we do see that in some of his poetry, and a lot of his poetry actually. And he wrote what's called the Preparatory Meditations, and there is roughly, there's over 100 of them. I'm not going to give an exact number because I'm not even sure myself. I think it was around 140 or so, but I know it's over 100. And he would write these poems the Saturday night before he was going to give the sacrament to his congregation the next day. So it was in preparation for giving the sacrament. So they're very, very, very personal. He uses a lot of very strong language. There's the one, I forget the number, 56 or something, vile, and he's defiled and a lump of loathsomeness, and he's really pretty hard on himself, but he was acknowledging his sinful ways, and so it was his way of preparing himself mentally, acknowledging his sins, asking God for forgiveness before, to make him even somewhat worthy to give his congregation the sacrament the next day. So that's why they are very, very, very personal. He wrote other poetry as well, upon a spider catching a fly, Coswabery. Those are not part of the metaphysical conceits. I'm sorry, those are not part of the preparatory meditations, but they are metaphysical conceits, those two in particular. Because, again, a conceit is our metaphor that runs throughout the length of the poem. In his case, now he did write metaphysical conceits, and like in Bradstreet, hers were not metaphysical. And that was a popular writing technique that a lot of the 16th, 17th century poets used, British poets used. One of them was John Donne, and he was, Edward Taylor was very influenced by him. So a metaphysical conceit is a metaphor in which something earthly is compared to something divine or something heavenly. So Coswabery, in that poem, it is the act of sewing or spinning, making yarn, making clothing, is then a metaphor compared to being a Christian or being someone that is going out and sharing the word of God. So it's his prayer to God that he will make him complete so that he can go out and spread the word. We talked about with several things that are being compared upon a spider catching a fly. So you have spider. The spider was symbolic of what, or a metaphor for what? Satan. The spider represented Satan. The web, which the spider was weaving, would be sin. The fly would be sinners. You had the wasp, who would be a metaphor symbolic of Christians or the elect. And so I guess that's pretty much it. Let's talk about that a little bit. Make sure you know a little bit about predestination, which was with the Puritans, and the Puritans were Calvinists. And they left England because the Charles I, I believe it was on the throne. There were several that were, but the Church of England was Catholic. And so the Puritans being Calvinist, which is Protestant. And so the Church of England was very much persecuting these Calvinists, these Puritans. The Puritans believed in predestination, which was, and Calvinists also believed that everyone is born of sin because of Adam and Eve's sin. And so you come into the world as a sinner. And they believed at this time period, the Puritans, the Calvinists, that an individual had no control over their salvation, and that God chose who would be saved and who would not be saved. So those who were saved and chosen by God were called the elect, E-L-E-C-T, not select, the elect. And the expectation was that the elect, if you were part of the elected, or part of the elect, you would have a conversion experience. So if you were part of the elect, you would know that you were part of the elect because of this conversion experience. And so once you had the conversion experience, you were expected to go in front of the church and share your experience with the congregation. And they were very strict about that. If you had not had this conversion experience and were not part of the elect, your children could not be baptized in the Puritan church. Well, anyway, so a predestination, very important part of the Calvinists at that time. They did change later. We'll get to him. We would take Jonathan Edwards later when it called upon the Calvinists to change their way of thinking on that predestination. But anyway, at this point, they still believe that your salvation came from God and you had no control over it. Let's see what else do we want to say about Edward Taylor? I guess that's pretty much it. And then we had Mary Rawlinson was the last one that we talked about. And so she wrote the first captive narrative. Another good Puritan woman. Her husband was also a minister. They lived in Lancaster, a community there, and they lived a little bit outside the community. So Metacomet was the chief of the Wampanoag Indians, and he named himself because of his dealing with and business dealings more or less with the colonists, and so he called himself King Philip. And so the King Philip's War that went on really for probably about 3 years, but the last year was when it really was extremely brutal, bloody. It pretty much, there's about 1,000 colonists, I think, at the end of that were killed. And the colonists pretty much wiped out the Wampanoags. And so that war, King Philip's War, was precipitated by the hanging. The colonists hanged 3 Wampanoag men. I don't know why. I don't know why they did that. So the King Philip's War. So Mary Rawlinson was captured by the Wampanoags. Her little daughter, Sarah, who was 6, I was thinking she was younger, but she was 6. So I'm sorry if I misstated that last week. She was 6, and she was also wounded. She was shot in the hand and in the stomach, and she died like 9 days later. Sarah did. And Mary was also shot, and she got a wound as well, but she lived. She lived through hers, was able to recuperate from it. And so she lived with, or was a captive of the Wampanoags for almost 12 weeks. And it was very, very, very rough. They would walk miles at a time, and she, for the most part, had to walk, even though they were on horses. But they did soften up to her somewhat. At least her owner did, and actually ended up, I guess, treating her fairly well. They didn't kill her, for one thing. She did, it's interesting though, in her text, continued throughout to call them heathen. She uses quite rough language in addressing them or in talking about them. So heathen, savages, but she did maintain her faith throughout the text, and she repeatedly throughout it talks about, she kept her eyes on God, and was always prayerful, always very thankful. Even when she lost her daughter, when her daughter died, she still always remained very faithful to God. And she was ransomed back to her husband. And so immediately when she got back home, she began writing this text. She was not a writer. It's the only thing she ever wrote. But she did want to put something out there because she was one of the only people that, as an adult, especially, that had ever lived through being captured by Native Americans and living to tell about it. So she wrote of her account. When it's in the textbook and all, it's called the first remove, second, the third remove. And a remove means when they travel. I was thinking it was days and all of that. But it does mean remove meant every time the group would get up and move locations. They were kind of nomadic in that way, I guess. And so she wrote this account. And she did write it with the intent of it being published, and it was, even though women, of course, she was a good Puritan woman, and again, Anne Bradstreet, they very much frowned upon women writing, and especially having anything published, but she had the foreword to her text was written by John Winthrop, So he kind of gave his stamp of approval. And then, Increase Mathers, who was another Puritan minister, a very devout Puritan leader of that area, Massachusetts and all, what's now Massachusetts. And he wrote at the end, he did a little something, about how brave she was and how she remained faithful to God and this sort of thing. So since they kind of bookended her text, it was okay for her to write it, and they gave the stamp of approval, these two good Puritan men, leaders. And so her text was published. It was widely read, very popular in England and throughout the colonies. And so it is the first example of a captive narrative. And that genre became very popular among the Puritans. Remember, the Puritans weren't really supposed to read anything that wasn't religious or go back in some way to religion or their beliefs, but they were allowed to read these, the captive narratives. And so that kind of set up that whole genre, and it was popular even through the beginning of Romanticism. So one of the early American romantics, James Fenimore Cooper, was that's what he wrote, was captive narratives. He didn't experience that. Well, actually, he did experience that. I'll take that back. He was himself captured as a young boy and spent a long time. He was raised by a band of Indians, and so he did know what he was talking about. All right, and I guess that's pretty much it. We will end with her, Mary Rawlinson. So tomorrow I will give you the assignment which y'all are going to work on. And I'll give y'all several days to work on it, but it is going to be one of 5 African American poets. So we'll do that tomorrow. Any questions? Anything?